Jesus tells an interesting story in one of the, in actually Matthew and Luke's Gospels. He's having a kind of controversy with people who have seen him doing a healing and who think that he may be doing that by the power of Beelzebub. And so they engage in dialogue. And in the course of that conversation, Jesus says, suppose there was an unclean spirit who was cast out of a person, and they wandered about looking for a place to rest. And finding none, they went back to the house from which they'd been ejected. And finding it neat and in order, they went in and came back in 7 times the strength to make their home there. It's one of the more peculiar stories in the Gospels. But I think that Jesus is talking about something pretty ordinary. I think Jesus is saying that the absence of evil does not create good, but that goodness needs to be an active presence of itself. Goodness is an active presence, not merely the absence of evil. We are talking about Sabbath in this sermon series, and I want to suggest today that Sabbath is an openness to experiencing the presence of God, the presence of goodness, the presence of God. And going back to that little illustration that Jesus makes, he suggests that life, in the absence of something actively bad going on, can be without chaos, maybe even neat and orderly, but still empty. And spiritual emptiness is as much a hazard as spiritual chaos. I think that's what Jesus is suggesting. So Sabbath is open to the presence of God. Now, we heard Stan do 2 very different stories, kind of related to temple. The Psalm, and the reason that he asked you guys to chime in and sing is that the Psalms, many of them were written for use in worship and probably were set to music. And the psalm that Stan read earlier was one of those that was meant for envisioning a pilgrimage to the temple. So Jews who lived all around the Mediterranean area would at least once a year, or actually there were 3 different festival days where they would try to make a pilgrimage to the temple. It's kind of an inspiring vision of the people who have come a long way through a dry and weary land, looking up on the hill and seeing the temple in the distance and anticipating how wonderful it will be to be in this place with the presence of God. And there's something about the experience, anticipating it, thinking about it, that creates a kind of pathway for God in our hearts, for God's Spirit to dwell therein. So there's a story about kind of really going to church. And the other story is so very different. It's Jesus in one of his most memorable moments. Now, I imagine, how many of you have heard the story of Jesus clearing the temple before? I want to do a little bit of cleaning of that story so that you can hear it just as John is telling it, because the gospel writers, although Jesus clears the temple in all 4 stories of the life of Jesus, the gospel writers have little different interpretations of that story. And it probably only happened historically once. But the Gospel of John says that the clearing of the temple happens near the beginning of Jesus' ministry. In fact, it happens right after Jesus' first miracle in the Gospel of John, where he changes water into wine so that a celebration of union at a wedding ceremony can continue. Jesus then goes into the temple to clear it. Now, how many of you, when you hear the story, hear the echo of the words, "My house should be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves"? Yes? Okay, throw that out of your head, because Jesus doesn't say that here. In John's telling, something very different happens. Now, we know, if you've heard some of the Old Testament stories and even from some of the New, that what happens in the temple is prescribed by the law, ways that people connect with God through rituals. And the rituals involve sacrifices of animals. Pilgrims who would have been coming from a long distance would not be able to bring their sheep or their cow or even a dove with them on the trip. In order to do the ritual sacrifices prescribed by law that would be part of experiencing the presence of God, they needed to have those animals available, and there they were, conveniently in the temple for their use. Also, something that needed to be transacted in the temple was that a temple tax would need to be paid, kind of like the support for the place of worship and for the people who run it. And the people who lived all over the empire, all over the dispersed places where Jews lived, had only their foreign coin with them, but they had to pay the temple tax in something that did not bear the image of the emperor. And so they needed to change money at the temple so that they could pay the tax in an acceptable form of currency. So the two things that were happening in the temple were actually very necessary parts of observing the requirements of the law, the prescribed way that people were brought into the presence of God. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus gets angry and overturns the tables and messes up the money stuff and drives out the sellers because he is somehow accusing them of being cheaters in the way they're taking advantage of people's need for this service and making an extra profit off it. There's some kind of allegation that what's happening is not happening the way it should, that it's being manipulated and used, and that the people are being a little corrupt. And that is the occasion for Jesus' anger. But in this story, that is not the case at all. Jesus does not accuse them of being unethical or dishonest. Jesus says that actually the practice itself is making the relationship with God transactional. It's a marketplace. Jesus, only in this story, actually drives out the animals, actually drives out the things that were part of that sacrificial exchange. And Jesus, in the Gospel of John, is doing something much more profound than in the other stories. Jesus is saying that the very heart of the way people have connected with God through this exchange, You tell me to do this for you, I do this for you, you do for me what I want. That is not how people experience the presence of God. And that's why then it's so important that he goes on to say, this temple, if it's torn down, I will build it up again in 3 days. Because Jesus was making a very radical claim right then that you experience the presence of God through him in a relationship with him. How very different it is to think about experiencing the presence of God as a relationship with a person rather than as a transaction to be bought, sold, managed. The presence of God, being filled with the presence of God. So that's what I want to think about today. It's kind of an abstract thing, isn't it? Now, oftentimes, the rabbis, when they talked about the Sabbath as a queen or a bride. They said, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, sanctify it. And the same Hebrew word sanctify was also the same word that would be used in like betrothing someone. So you make someone holy, you sanctify them by the actions you take in a relationship, by building and honoring a relationship. The rabbis sometimes referred to the Sabbath as the bride, the betrothed. They said 6 days God worked, created space for humans to work. On the 7th day, God rested to be filled with companionship and fellowship. One of my, I do love music of all kinds, but it's so funny because my very favorite moments in music, we got to hear a wonderful symphony a few weeks ago, and my very favorite part of the entire symphony is in the seconds after it ends. That's why I hate it when people start clapping really quickly. And by the way, that's why I don't clap for the choir, hardly ever, because I like the silence, because that silence is so full of savoring. It is when, while you're listening to the music, you are trying to pick up the melodies and hold them in your memory. It's active, you're working, you're trying to hear this part and that part. What's being repeated, what's not being repeated, what's the variation. And then when it's over, you just let it all sink in and wash over you. And it's, as a whole, just wondrous. I think that's what the Sabbath is like. The Sabbath is for savoring. How many of you have ever tried journaling? Yeah. So many people that I know and admire journal. And so even though I don't like to write, I have tried journaling at different points. And I have not had good luck with it because all I find that I'm doing on paper is drooling out the same thoughts that are going on in my head all the time. I make a job of it. But one time I tried journaling totally differently. I didn't even actually think I was journaling. I said, I'm going to start keeping a diary. And so at night, I would just take a piece of paper and I would write down some of the things I wanted to hold on to from the day, some of the wonderful things. And I found that savoring helped me be much more aware of the presence of God, much more thoughtful and intentional, not like I was planning to be, but because I was savoring what had been good, what had been noteworthy, what had been delightful or surprising, no matter how big or small it was. I inadvertently kind of caught myself doing spiritual stuff. Once I realized that was my task that I was doing, then I kind of flipped on my head. It didn't last for very long. I'm going to try that again. But I think worship time and Sabbath time is made for savoring. Thankfulness, gratitude, reflection. Even the things that we come and have as burdens on our hearts and minds for people we love and care, the prayer concerns we bring up, we have those concerns because the ties we have with others and with our community are precious. Even lifting up the sad and difficult things is an affirmation of God's presence in the world. So the Sabbath, I think, part of that experiencing the presence of God is that we savor the week that's gone before. How many of you have thought, as I have at different times, that the idea of worshiping God, that God, demands that we worship, that we, give our praise and our admiration to God, is a little bit egocentric on God's part? I've sometimes wondered about this. And when I was thinking about this, experiencing the presence of God on the Sabbath, and the rabbis calling the Sabbath a bride, I thought, well, relationship requires the longing of two. So what does God want from us? Affection on the Sabbath? And I remembered, I played the piano for a long time growing up. I practiced a lot. I was really serious about it. I practiced hours. I got taken to a lot of music lessons and recitals, and it impacted the family schedule and finances. And my parents, worked hard to make that happen. Mostly my mom was the hands-on person who was behind that. And she was the one who would, debrief when we'd come home from a piano competition or something. But every now and then, not extremely regularly, but every now and then, starting when I was in middle school, my dad would come into the living room where the piano was, kind of late evening as the day was quieting down, and he'd look at me and he'd say, "Play me my $10,000. Just like that. And because my dad was never one of those people who was comparing, he never came out of a recital or a competition and compared me to anybody else. He was a very naive music listener, but he just kind of enjoyed it. And I would go and sit down at the piano, and unlike normally when I would really worry about playing something as well as I could, I would just take a few things that I thought I had pretty well in my grasp. And if I came to a mistake and I'd play it, I wouldn't worry. I'd kind of do the thing that musicians can do to smooth it over and make it seem like it's not a mistake. It wasn't accurate, but it sounded better. And I just try to make the music as lovely as possible. And my dad, who always said that he listens better with his eyes closed, and sometimes I imagine he was asleep, but not always. My dad would close his eyes and listen as the night was coming down, and then he'd just say, "Well, that was very fine." Now, I have to tell you, at $10,000, that amount that he said never changed. So I know it wasn't a real amount. It wasn't really what he put into it. Back in those dollars, that probably was kind of like a high amount. I think he had a double meaning about it. It was not just his investment, that he wanted to enjoy the fruits of his investment. It was also that he was saying this was a priceless concert to him. And it was enjoyable in that way. And it was probably one of the more enjoyable times that I ever played music, too. Because I was just thinking only about creating enjoyment for someone. I think that that is the way God sees worship. Give me my $10,000. I've been investing in you a long time. You don't always know when I have been, but I've been investing in you. Come and sing praise for me. Come and pray to me. Come and listen. Let's spend some time together just enjoying something good and beautiful. And that's why I think worship is important. To savor what is good. To enjoy the presence of God. And you know, I'm pretty sure that on any given Sunday, you may not like the actual music or the message, you may not relate to it, but week in, week out, over time, it creates in us a dwelling place for God's Spirit. Of that I have no doubt. And if we only come when we need something from God, and it is transactional, or we feel like we have a role to play, to do our duty, we are missing out on creating the space inside for a delightful, delightful relationship. So the Sabbath is made for fellowship. And believe it or not, one of the main ways that we can fellowship with God is by using this time to commune with each other as well. So as we come today and prepare to receive the invitation to Holy Communion, I hope that you savor the experience of God's grace at this open table. God will enjoy your enjoyment. Amen.